In this section of the course, we're going to talk about materials, and we're going to split that into 3 separate chapters. Going all the way back to the past, where do our textiles come from? Going all the way back to the very start. We're then going to look at the last 50 years up to the present day, and then last we're going to look at the future. What will our clothes and materials look like, in the next couple of years up to the next 50 years? It's going to look very different to today. So first of all, we want to talk about the past. So how are we using fibers right back at the very start? Or why do we even have clothes? Well, we wore clothes for survival, to keep us warm, to give us shelter. And that started to change. Clothing started to be something that would help represent who we were. Maybe part of a tribe, maybe part of which part of class we were in. If you think of the Romans, certain people wore different clothes and that really identified who they were. Or if you go up to where I'm from in Scotland, your kilt. It was very representative of who your clan was. And it was made using wool, which was very local, and all the dyes were very local. So we've moved from that survival, we need clothes to just survive, to actually textiles being something that identifies who we are and our community. But then we start to move on a little bit from there. But overall, we're using those clothes for potentially even a generation. You use them, they adapt, a kilt, it grows with you. But those materials will be repurposed again, maybe handed on to someone else. And because they're natural and naturally dyed, they can go back to nature as well. So it's almost regenerative in that sense. And that's what the agricultural practices were like at that time as well. But how has that changed? Well, we started to see the Industrial Revolution and we started to be able to make clothes at a large scale, and it brought down the cost of them as well. And that changed a lot of things. It meant that fashion was starting to be accessible to more people as it started to ramp up, which was a good thing. So materials and how they've changed from the past into the last 50 years up to the present day. Now, have you gone into a store and seen that t-shirt for £5 or $5? You might have, or you might have seen it on the internet or something like this. I want you to think, how can a t-shirt be that cheap? What's happening in the world? How can that be done? Well, it's a mix of different things. First of all, really get critical around what does that mean for the environment and the people in the supply chain if you can buy a t-shirt for only £5 or $5? Okay, so a huge part of that has been the mass intensification of the production and farming of cotton. So the way that they're doing that is huge big monocultures, and what that means is you only see cotton from where you're standing right up to the horizon. Now if you have that, that doesn't happen in nature naturally. You have a mix of different plants and animals and all these things. But when we have these ginormous fields of cotton and it's only them, then we really start to reduce the biodiversity of the area. And a lot of cotton is grown in areas that there isn't consistent rainfall. So that means that space needs to be irrigated by water. And again, where's that water coming from? Is it coming out of rivers? Is it coming out of deep water wells? What impact does that have? If you're growing cotton on that scale, consistently, same crop every single year, you're really going to start to degrade that soil. And soil is really, really important if we want to continually grow foods and crops. So actually to support that, lots of chemicals need to be used, fertilizers. Again, a lot of these are synthetic. So all of these things are adding up, and you start to see how this huge big monoculture intensification of cotton production isn't so sustainable. Now, not only that, but in the production phase, we see lots of labor challenges around who's in the supply chain, what are they being paid, what sort of conditions are they working in. The intensification of the farming, plus these potential labor standards, these are the sort of things that get to that $5 or £5 t-shirt. And we have to really question, is that fair for the planet? And is it fair on those highly skilled people in the supply chain? So that's a big change of where we've got to from a long time ago to the last 50 years up to today. But the other change we start to see is the increasing use of synthetic fibers. So this started from the 1950s to 1960s. And the synthetics, the polyesters, were seen as this great fiber to be using because it was moisture wicking, it gave breathability. It meant that clothes didn't need as much drying, and you potentially didn't need to iron them either. So a lot of these things were based around convenience. And as our lifestyle started to change, as we started to do more sport and be more active as well. But what do we start to see around more and more synthetics is there's actually more polyester being used than natural fibers now by quite a long way, and that trend doesn't look like it's slowing down. Now there are the benefits, as we said, there's less drying time, less ironing, those are benefits. But what happens to this material? Where are those synthetics coming from? Well, they're actually coming from oil, which is a fossil fuel. It's a finite resource, we're running out of it. And that industry is something we need to move away from when we think about the climate crisis. Now, also I want you to think about what happens with those synthetic fibers once someone's finished with them. They're very difficult to recycle, which we talk about later in the course. So we need to think about where do they go? If they go into a landfill, they're going to be around for a very, very long time. So again, that's where the benefits of natural fibers. But what we also want to think about is how can we move away from synthetics that come from oil and start to use some existing materials that are already in circulation to make these synthetic products if we need to buy them. So you've probably seen on Netflix, BBC, whatever it might be, you've seen the giant fishing nets, you've seen the ocean plastic. These are great sources that we can start to use as replacements of oil in our clothing, as well as the packaging, the recycling we do at home, all those plastic bottles, they can be collected and used in our synthetic materials as well. So we are starting to see the industry shift pretty quickly into using recycled synthetics rather than virgin from oil. And that's also the same with cotton. We're seeing more and more recycled cotton being used, and this is a really, really good move. The more that we can use existing materials rather than virgin ones, we start to move in a slightly more circular direction. Now it's really just the start, but it's a move in the right direction that we need to continue. So what does the future of the materials we're wearing look like? Well, again, we're in this period of huge overproduction and overconsumption. There's so many fibers already in existence today, whether it be in the back of our wardrobes, in charity warehouses, or maybe even the global south in a landfill there. All of that's already in existence. Why aren't we tapping into that? Why are we drilling new oil to make new synthetics? Why are we really using and abusing the land to do this intensive production of cotton when all these fibers already exist? So when we talk about the linear model, these clothes are being used, maybe a second time, but they're almost always ending in a landfill or incineration in the very end. When we think about circular fashion and circular materials, we need to capture those right at the end and bring them right the way back to the start again, and start to create that circular loop. And we're seeing that from cotton, where you're seeing a lot of recycled cotton being used more and more, and actually it's cheaper than using virgin cotton. So there's a huge commercial benefit there as well. We'll talk later on in the course around the difference around second generation materials, particularly within synthetics. There's some challenges there in terms of how you turn an old synthetic t-shirt into a new recycled one using those same fibers, but it's getting there using things like chemical recycling. So we see a lot of innovation there, and then we see some other ones which are semi-chemical, which is dissolving natural fibers and then turning them into a viscose-like material. This is all really, really exciting and a huge part of what the future needs to look like if we're going to create materials within our planetary boundaries. Now beyond that, we can think about the byproducts in different industries. So if we look at agriculture, when we're growing cereal crops, we have the straw left over. Now that straw could actually go back into the soil and help regenerate that soil's health. But we can also think about maybe that straw could be used and those fibers could be turned into fibers for clothing. We can think about that for coconuts or pineapple or orange peel as well. What's happening with those materials today, and how could they be turned into a high value fiber to make clothing? Now those are all byproducts, which means that it's not requiring new oil to be dug out of the ground, or that intensive cotton production we talked about before. Now that land ideally is probably going to be used for food, particularly in the future as land really starts to get more impacted by the climate crisis. So where else are all these materials? We have a surplus amount of milk being produced because a lot of governments heavily subsidize this industry. How could that milk be used to create new fibers? I know it sounds quite crazy. Or beyond that, how can we use bacteria? How can we use bacteria today in the dye processes instead of using natural or synthetic dyes? But let's think even further. Why do we need to use land anyway to grow all these fibers, whether it be an agri-byproduct or directly from cotton? Why don't we use bacteria to grow new fibers in lab environments? Now that means that land out there can still be used for food production, and then we can use bacteria to grow new fibers. Now that's a really, really exciting space for me, and that's one way that I can see the huge benefits in terms of energy, emissions, land use, and still being able to produce these new fibers that we need going forward. So that's a flavor of what the future might look like. But there's also elements of what the future materials look like that actually go back to what we talked about at the start. This regenerative style of farming, which by no means is rocket science, is going back to looking after the land the best way possible so that soil isn't degraded, that we don't just grow one crop in the field, we grow multiple crops. And those crops growing one beside each other are symbiotic, and it brings different pollinators to that area. And it starts to restore that soil so it can last, generations rather than the way we're degrading it today. So it's really good to see that regenerative farming is coming back not only to the food industry, but also within the fashion space. And we're seeing increasing brands starting to use more and more organic as well, which is really, really good if we want to start to look after the environment that we're growing our fashion in. We look forward to sharing more details around the future of fashion throughout this course.